The Italian mob thought they could control Joe Louis. They thought they could trap the brown bomber with fine print and fake promises. They thought a simple contract would make the heavyweight champion their property. They were wrong. Power doesn't always announce itself with shouting or gunfire. Sometimes it walks into a small office quietly. Sometimes it stands behind you while your hand is on the pen. Sometimes it carries cold steel instead of ink. Because when Bumpy Johnson walked into that office on August 14, 1940, he wasn't carrying a contract. He wasn't there to negotiate. He wasn't there to talk numbers or percentages. He was carrying a razor. That razor didn't come out fast. It didn't need to. There was no rush, no panic, no raised voice. Just the sudden understanding that everything in that room had changed in 1 second. And what happened next made 3 mobsters tear up 15 pages of paperwork and flee Harlem forever. Not because they lost an argument, not because a deal fell through, but because they realized they had crossed into a place where contracts didn't protect you. This is the untold moment when Harlem drew a line, and the mob crossed it. Harlem in 1940 was alive in a way few places on earth could match. Music spilled out of clubs onto the sidewalks. Voices argued, laughed, dreamed all at once. There was energy in the air, but it wasn't carefree, it was charged, because Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a statement, a place where black success was visible, loud, and impossible to ignore. But that visibility came with danger. Every win attracted eyes that didn't clap. Every dollar attracted hands that didn't earn it. Black excellence stood tall in Harlem, but it stood under constant pressure. From the police, from politicians, from gangs, from men in suits who smiled while sharpening knives behind their backs. And standing at the center of all that attention was Joe Louis, 26 years old, young, quiet, soft-spoken, and the most famous black man in America. He wasn't just a heavyweight champion, he was proof that black strength couldn't be denied, proof that discipline could beat hatred, proof that the world had to watch, even if it didn't want to. When Joe Louis stepped into the ring, the noise stopped, because in the ring, Joe Louis was invincible. Outside the ring, he was a target. 2 years earlier, he had knocked out Max Schmeling in front of 70,000 people. It wasn't just a fight, it was a moment loaded with politics, pride, and pressure. America was watching, Germany was watching, Black America was holding its breath. And when Joe won, it felt like more than a victory. It felt like a message sent through a right hand. But victories come with weight. Every punch he threw carried expectations. Every appearance carried symbolism. Joe didn't ask to be a symbol, but history chose him anyway. And symbols attract predators, especially when the symbol doesn't know how sharp the world outside the ring really is. Joe Louis knew how to fight men with fists. What he didn't yet know was how dangerous men with paperwork could be. And on one August afternoon in Harlem, that lesson was waiting for him behind a desk, with a pen and a contract. Money came to Joe Louis fast, faster than anyone had ever prepared him for. One fight could bring in more cash than his parents had seen in a lifetime, checks with more zeros than advice attached to them. And when money comes that fast, it doesn't stay long unless someone teaches you how to hold on to it. The money went everywhere. Taxes took their share. Family needed help. Friends needed favors. Distant relatives appeared with stories and needs. Everyone had a reason, and Joe didn't know how to say no. Because where he came from, success wasn't something you hoarded. It was something you shared. There were hangers-on everywhere. People who laughed a little too hard. People who always agreed. People who called him brother but never brought answers. They didn't carry weapons. They carried suggestions, business ideas, opportunities, sure things, all wrapped in confidence and smiles. Joe had never been taught financial language. No one had explained contracts. No one had broken down taxes. No one had told him what a lawyer was supposed to do for him. He knew how to train. He knew how to fight. He knew how to win. But nobody ever trained him for what came after the bell. And Joe wasn't stupid. He was just young, generous, and surrounded by smiles. This wasn't new. Black athletes had been exploited like this for decades. Paid well, protected poorly, celebrated in public, stripped quietly in private. Managers, promoters, advisors, all taking pieces until the champion was left confused and broke. The most dangerous part wasn't violence. It was paperwork. Because a punch you can see coming, a contract hides its damage until it's too late. And Joe Louis, the most feared man in the ring, was walking into a world where nobody taught him which smiles to trust. That's what made him vulnerable. Not weakness, not greed, but the absence of protection in a world designed to take advantage of men just like him. That August afternoon, Joe Louis wasn't sitting in a gym. He wasn't surrounded by trainers or gloves or sweat. He was sitting in a small office on 125th Street, a cramped room with peeling paint, a single desk pushed against the wall. No windows open, no air moving, just quiet pressure hanging in the room. Across from him sat three men who didn't belong there. Not because they were white, but because they carried themselves like predators pretending to be professionals. Expensive suits, perfectly pressed, shoes polished enough to reflect the flickering light above. Their clothes cost more than everything in that office combined. Vincent Gallo did most of the talking. Mid-50s, slick hair, a smile that never reached his eyes. The kind of man who spoke softly so you leaned in without realizing why. Frank Marino sat beside him, thick neck, heavy hands, quiet muscle pretending to be a businessman. And Anthony DiNapoli stayed close to the paperwork. Younger, restless, the one who slid pages forward and tapped where signatures should go. They didn't introduce themselves as mobsters. They introduced themselves as advisors, investment men, people who understood money, people who understood opportunity, men who claimed they were there to protect Joe's future. They laid the contract on the desk between them. 15 pages, small print, big promises. Gallo spoke slowly, smoothly, like he was doing Joe a favor. He talked about life after boxing, about what happens when the cheering stops, when the punches don't come anymore. He talked about security, stability, legacy, words designed to land gently but sink deep. Then he brought out the name that made Joe's eyes lift, the Cotton Club. He painted it like a dream, Harlem's most famous nightclub, elegance, celebrity, money flowing every night. And then he talked about expansion, more locations, more doors opening, more profits coming in. All Joe had to do was believe. Frank leaned forward and sealed it with numbers. $50,000 now, triple returns later, guaranteed, 10% ownership. A partner, not just a fighter. Joe Louis's Cotton Club, his name on the door. Joe could see it. He could picture walking into a place that belonged to him, not as entertainment, not as attraction, but as an owner, a man with something solid waiting for him after the ring. What Joe couldn't see was what lived between the lines, because that contract wasn't written for him to understand. It was written for him to trust. The language looked official, legal phrases, corporate structure, projected profits, everything designed to feel legitimate, respectable, safe. But buried in that paperwork was the truth. A truth Joe wasn't trained to recognize. A truth the men across from him were counting on him to miss. They weren't selling Joe an investment. They were selling him a future that didn't exist. A future built entirely on ink, pressure, and the assumption that a heavyweight champion wouldn't read past the promise. And sitting there in that office, surrounded by smiles and suits, Joe Louis was closer to losing everything than he had ever been in any ring. The contract looked clean at first glance. Official language, formal structure, the kind of paperwork meant to calm you down before you ask questions. Margins aligned, pages numbered, nothing that screamed danger unless you knew where to look. What Joe didn't know was that the real deal was never on the first page. It lived deep inside the fine print, past the confident promises, past the bold numbers, hidden where only lawyers and predators ever bother to read. The ownership wasn't real. The 10% stake existed only on paper. It sat inside a shell company that didn't actually own the Cotton Club, didn't control the money, didn't control the doors. Joe wouldn't be a partner. He'd be a name attached to nothing. The returns weren't guaranteed either. They were tied to performance clauses, written to fail, metrics that could be adjusted, benchmarks that could be missed on purpose. On paper, it looked fair. In reality, it meant Joe would never see a dollar back. And then there was the escape clause, or what looked like an escape clause. If Joe ever tried to pull his money out, he'd owe more than he put in. Early withdrawal penalties, double the investment. A financial chokehold disguised as protection. This wasn't an investment. It was a cage made of legal language. This was a classic mob play. They had done it to boxers before, to musicians, to athletes who made money fast but didn't grow up reading contracts. You put the money in, you never get it back, and somehow you end up owing them more than you started with. The brilliance of the scam wasn't the paperwork, it was the timing. They didn't rush Joe. They made him feel responsible, made him feel like walking away would be foolish, like hesitation meant weakness. They spoke about trust, about respect, about opportunity closing soon, pressure dressed up as concern, urgency disguised as advice. And sitting there at that desk, Joe Louis didn't see thieves. He saw professionals, men who spoke calmly, men who wore confidence like armor. What they saw was simpler. A champion who could be outboxed without throwing a punch, a fortune waiting to be redirected with ink instead of fists, and all it would take was one signature. The room went quiet. Not the calm kind of quiet, the kind that presses against your chest, the kind that makes every movement feel louder than it should. Joe stared at the contract again. 15 pages. Small print. Big promises. The words blurred together now, not because he didn't care, but because the pressure was working. $50,000 was a lot of money, almost everything he had saved. Walking away felt irresponsible, like turning down his future, like admitting he didn't understand a world he was supposed to be stepping into. The men across from him didn't rush him. They didn't have to. They just watched, confident, patient, like hunters who knew the animal was already tired. Joe swallowed. His hand moved slowly across the desk, fingers brushing the smooth surface. The pen sat there waiting, heavy for something so small. Joe reached for the pen. No one spoke. No chairs moved. No papers shuffled. The air itself felt frozen, as if the room was holding its breath along with him. This was the moment everything could have ended. Not with a punch, not with a headline, but with ink touching paper. One signature, one decision, one quiet mistake that would have followed Joe Louis for the rest of his life. And then, the door opened. The door opened without a knock, no warning, no hesitation. It didn't swing wide or slam shut. It opened just enough to let silence walk into the room. The man who stepped inside didn't rush. He didn't scan the room nervously. He didn't need to announce who he was. His presence did that for him. Calm, measured, unbothered. Like someone stepping into a space he already owned. Bumpy Johnson walked in like time slowed down around him. Dark suit, perfectly fitted, white shirt clean and sharp, black tie straight. Everything about him said control. Not the loud kind, the dangerous kind. He didn't look at the Italians first. He looked at Joe, saw the pen, saw the hesitation, saw the moment frozen in place. Then he spoke, put the pen down. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't carry anger. It carried certainty, the kind of certainty that doesn't ask to be obeyed. It expects it. Joe looked up, confused, caught between worlds. Bumpy didn't explain, didn't argue, didn't repeat himself. He just stood there, waiting, and somehow that was more powerful than shouting ever could be. Joe slowly set the pen on the desk. That's when the room shifted, not physically, but spiritually. The Italians felt it before they understood it. The air changed, the balance changed. The smiles stopped working. Bumpy finally turned his attention to them. His eyes moved from face to face. Not angry, not curious, just measuring, like a man deciding how much trouble something might cause him. One of the men tried to smile, tried to speak, tried to reclaim control with words. But words had lost their value the moment Bumpy walked in. This wasn't a meeting anymore. It was a reckoning. Bumpy didn't sit down, didn't need to. Standing was enough. Standing reminded everyone who answered to who in Harlem. The Italians weren't facing a boxer now. They weren't dealing with paperwork or percentages. They were standing in front of a man whose reputation had already walked in ahead of him. A man who didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't negotiate when he didn't have to. And everyone in that room understood the same thing at the same time. Whatever was about to happen next would not be decided by ink. Bumpy didn't rush to the desk. He didn't grab the contract. He didn't touch anything at first. He just looked around the room, at the walls, at the suits, at the faces pretending this was still a business meeting. Then he spoke again. Not loud, not sharp, just clear. He said Joe's name like a reminder, like a grounding force. Joe, let me ask you something. His eyes never left the men across the desk. You ever been inside the Cotton Club? Joe shook his head slowly. No explanation. No excuse. Just the truth sitting there between them. Bumpy nodded once, like he already knew the answer. Then he turned back to the Italians. And that's when the room really tightened. You're telling me they made you a partner in a club that won't even let you through the front door? The words landed heavier than any threat, because they didn't just expose the scam. They exposed the insult behind it. The Cotton Club wasn't a mystery in Harlem. Everyone knew the rule. Black performers on stage, white customers in the seats, talent welcomed, ownership forbidden. And now these men were pretending Joe Louis would be an exception. Bumpy let the silence stretch, because silence forces lies to sit with themselves. He stepped closer to the desk, picked up the contract, didn't read it line by line, didn't need to. He flipped through pages like a man who had seen this story before. Different names, same trick. He pointed without looking down. Page buried deep. Section meant to be skipped. Words designed to confuse instead of clarify. He translated it calmly. This part means they control your money. This part means you never see returns. This part means if you try to leave, you owe them more than you gave. No anger in his voice. Just certainty. This isn't an investment, he said quietly. It's a setup. One of the men tried to interrupt, tried to explain, tried to wrap theft back into opportunity, but Bumpy didn't argue. He didn't need to. He let the truth sit naked on the desk. He looked back at Joe. This is how they do it. They don't come with guns. They come with compliments. They don't threaten you. They flatter you. They make you feel chosen, special, lucky. Then he turned again to the Italians, and now his tone changed just enough to matter. You didn't walk into Harlem to make Joe rich. You walked in here because you thought he didn't know any better. That was the real mistake, because scams only work when the target is alone, and Joe Louis wasn't alone anymore. The room understood that before anyone said another word. Bumpy reached into his waistband slowly, not dramatic, not rushed, like a man pulling out a watch instead of a weapon. And that's when the room stopped pretending. The razor came out still folded, still harmless looking. But everyone in that office knew what it meant. It wasn't decoration. It wasn't a prop. It was history, reputation, memory, all wrapped in cold steel. He placed it on the desk gently, right next to the contract. Metal beside paper, truth beside lies. He didn't push it forward, didn't point it at anyone. He simply let it sit there, let it speak for itself. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The air had weight now, the kind that presses down on your chest, the kind that makes breathing feel loud. Bumpy looked at the men across from him, not angry, not excited, just disappointed, like they had wasted his time. Let me tell you what's going to happen next, he said quietly. His finger tapped the contract once, not hard, just enough. You're going to tear this up, every page, right here, in front of me. Then, his finger rested near the razor. And if you don't, if you hesitate, if you think about walking out of here with Joe Louis's money tied up in your paperwork, then I make sure your future carries a reminder of today. He let that sit, didn't explain right away, didn't rush the meaning. You can choose ink, or you can choose scars. But either way, this deal ends now. One of the men tried to speak, tried to bring back business language, tried to mention connections, influence, people who wouldn't like this. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He leaned in just enough to matter. I don't care who you work with. In Harlem, I am the connection. He glanced at Joe for a moment, then back to them. Joe Louis is not prey. He's not an opportunity. He's not a number on a balance sheet. His hand rested flat on the desk now, between the razor and the contract, a line drawn without being announced. You walked into Harlem thinking you could steal from one of our symbols, thinking contracts would protect you, thinking smiles would distract him. They won't. So here's your choice. You tear that contract up right now. You walk out of Harlem, and you never come back looking for Joe Louis again. Or you leave with something written on you that no amount of money will ever erase. The silence stretched, longer than before. Sweat showed, hands shook, eyes dropped to the desk, to the razor, back to Bumpy's face. This wasn't negotiation anymore. It was mercy being offered, and everyone in that room knew it, because Bumpy Johnson didn't yell, didn't threaten loudly, didn't need witnesses. Absolute authority doesn't explain itself. It simply waits for obedience. No one moved at first. The room sat frozen between two futures, ink or scars, paper or steel. Breath felt heavy. Time stretched. Then trembling hands reached for the contract. Not confident anymore. Not smooth. Just careful. Page 1 tore slowly, the sound sharp in the silence. Paper ripping where promises used to live. Another page followed. Then another. 15 pages reduced to strips and fragments. Small print shredded into nothing. Big promises turned to confetti. Each rip sounded louder than the last. No one spoke. No one laughed. No one protested. There was no argument left to make. Only obedience. When the last page was torn, the desk was covered in scraps. The deal no longer existed. Not legally. Not spiritually. Not in any way that mattered. Bumpy didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't celebrate. He simply watched, because real power doesn't need victory dances, it only needs results. The men stood slowly, eyes down, faces pale. They didn't threaten, didn't look back, didn't ask questions. They understood the lesson clearly. They had come to Harlem thinking they would take something. Instead, they were leaving with nothing but relief. No punches were thrown, no blood was spilled, no sirens were needed. The mob had been defeated without violence, and the razor never left the desk. They stepped out onto 125th Street together. The noise of Harlem rushed back in like the world had been waiting. Cars passed, voices called out, music drifted from somewhere down the block. Life moved on as if nothing inside that office had almost gone wrong. Joe walked beside Bumpy in silence for a few steps. His shoulders felt lighter now, but his mind was loud. Finally he spoke. "Bumpy, how did you even know I was there? How did you know something was wrong?" Bumpy didn't slow down, didn't turn his head. He spoke like the answer was obvious. "Word travels in Harlem. Somebody saw you walk into that office with 3 Italians in suits. That kind of thing doesn't stay quiet. Not here." People nodded as they passed them. Some out of respect, some out of recognition, some because they understood what protection looked like, even if they never said it out loud. "This place takes care of its own," Bumpy continued. "Not with speeches, not with newspapers, but with eyes, with ears, with people looking out for each other." Joe exhaled slowly. "I almost signed it," he said quietly. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was being smart." Bumpy stopped walking, turned to face him fully now. "Joe, you are smart. You're just trained for a different kind of fight." He placed a hand on Joe's shoulder. "Firm. Steady. There are more men trying to rob you with contracts than fists." Joe looked down. "Let that sink in. You know how to protect yourself in the ring," Bumpy said. "Out here, protection works different. Out here, the punches come wrapped in paper, and they smile before they swing." Joe nodded slowly, understanding, replacing embarrassment. From that moment on, he wasn't just walking through Harlem. He was learning how to survive it. They kept walking as Bumpy talked, not lecturing, not preaching, just explaining the world the way it really works when no one is cheering for you. "You want to invest? Fine," Bumpy said calmly, "but you don't use their lawyer. You get your own, someone who works for you, someone who gets paid to tell you no, not someone paid to make you feel comfortable." Joe listened closely now. No defenses, no pride in the way, just attention. "You read every word," Bumpy continued. "Every sentence, every footnote, every line that looks boring, because the boring parts are where they hide the knife." Joe nodded slowly, thinking back to the pages he hadn't really read, the parts he trusted instead of understood. And if you don't understand something, you stop, you ask questions, you walk away if you have to, because the moment you feel rushed, that's the moment you're being pushed. They want you excited. Bumpy said, they want you dreaming, because dreaming people don't read fine print. They sign it. Joe let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Then Bumpy slowed his pace just enough to make the next words land. "And remember this, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is." That sentence stayed with Joe. Simple, clear, uncomfortable. "You don't owe anyone access to you," Bumpy went on. "You don't owe them your money. You don't owe them your future. Saying no doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you free.